Welcome to another episode of TP Talks, PwC's global transfer pricing podcast series, where we discuss key transfer pricing developments from around the world. My name is Christina Novak, and I'm a principal in PwC's U.S. National Tax Services transfer pricing practice. Today, we're turning our attention back to Amount B of the OECD's Pillar 1 initiative. Last fall, as you'll recall, we covered Amount B, focusing on the OECD's July 2023 public consultation document. So today we plan to update you on the latest developments, including the OECD's Amount B final report from February of this year, and also the recent guidance that was released in June. I also have an additional update to share in case you missed it. Last week, the OECD also released a Model Competent Authority Agreement on the application of Amount B. But before we dive in, let me introduce today's guest speakers, and they're no strangers to the podcast. Joining me is Georgia Maffini. Georgia is a Transfer Pricing and Tax Policy Director from PwC UK. She formerly served as the Deputy Head of the Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the OECD. And also joining us is Kartikeya Singh, a principal in PwC's U.S. National Tax Practice and author of several articles covering Pillar 1. In fact, Kartikeya has an insightful article in Amount B that will be published soon in Tax Notes, so keep an eye out for that. Georgia, Kartikeya, great to have both of you back.
Thank you, Christina, and great to be back on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be back. And hi, everyone. It's been a while, but I'm happy to be back with my favorite podcasters.
Great. Let's dive right in. Georgia, can you give us a quick recap of the key elements from the OECD's July 2023 consultation document? And specifically, how did it move the discussion forward in terms of the scoping criteria and also the pricing method for Amount B?
Absolutely, Christina. So the July 2023 consultation was, I believe, a significant step forward. As we discussed in our previous episode, this consultation document provided, I think, really a clearer design of the two main issues, the scope, first of all, and second, the method and the specific figures for pricing. So in terms of scope, the 2023 document reduced the number of criteria for this of the scoping criteria from 12 in 2022 to just 4. And the document also introduced a discussion between Alternative A and Alternative B, and I know we'll delve into that later. But what is important that I think that the focus of the document was now clearly on wholesale distribution of physical goods, therefore excluding services, digital goods, and commodities. Then on the pricing front, the 2023 consultation finally presented a detailed pricing matrix, which specified the returns in terms of return on sales. And at that time, this detail provided really much needed clarity. And I think it also eased the fears of returns exceeding the arm's length standard by a very large amount. So in summary, the 2023 consultation provided a more pragmatic framework, which taxpayers could start using to model. And this means understanding the effects of Amount B for the first time. So looking back, probably the progress made in the 2023 document was a pivotal moment in the ongoing discussion of Amount B, but probably even more broadly in the ongoing discussion on distribution returns.
That's helpful, Georgia. Thanks for setting the stage. Now let's move forward. Let's move to February of this year. OECD releases their final report on Amount B, which of course contains the guidance on the pricing of certain baseline distribution activities. And this guidance was added as an annex to Chapter 4 of the OECD Transfer Pricing Guidelines. Kartikeya, can you tell us where the OECD landed in terms of whether Amount B will be mandatory or optional for countries?
Yeah, so the main takeaway is that Amount B adoption is not mandatory. So countries can choose to adopt Amount B or they can choose not to adopt it. And this optional approach, because it's not mandatory, in my view, is very likely because the inclusive framework was not able to bridge the divide between the countries that wanted Alternative A, this was the quantitative scoping criteria, and the countries that wanted alternative B. This was the qualitative scoping criteria. And Georgia alluded to it, and we'll come back to this a bit later as well. And since the scoping criteria in the February report is more in line with alternative A, making amount B optional or non-mandatory might have been the only way to get that second group of countries that preferred alternative B to sign off on this report. Now, what this means is that as things currently stand, countries have the following options. First, they can choose to adopt amount B, and if they do so, they can adopt it as a mandatory regime. So taxpayers with in-country, in-scope, baseline marketing and distribution operations must follow the amount B methodology if a country adopts it in mandatory form. Alternatively, an adopting country can make amount B a taxpayer elective safe harbor. In this case, taxpayer can choose to apply the amount B framework for an in-scope, in-country distributor, but it's not obligated to do so. Now, the second option for a country is that it doesn't adopt amount B. And not only does it not adopt amount B, it also does not respect the outcomes determined under amount B as applied in a counterparty jurisdiction. So simply put, the February report in effect gives countries the option of ignoring amount B and instead relying on what I would call a full-blown and more standard application of the arm's length principle. Now, on paper, there is this commitment from inclusive framework countries that a non-adopting country will respect a counterparty jurisdiction's adoption of amount B if that jurisdiction happens to be a covered jurisdiction. These were the jurisdictions that in the February report were referred to as low capacity jurisdictions, but in subsequent guidance that I think Georgia will talk about, a list of these countries was published and labeled as covered jurisdictions. So that's where we stand with respect to the implementation of amount B.
Got it. So with these different options, it sounds like we could end up with a pretty fragmented compliance landscape. Can you talk about the complexities that this might bring for taxpayers?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So what we may see in a fragmented sort of landscape is in many ways the right way of putting it, because what you'll see is that the transfer pricing documentation for many taxpayers is not going to be as straightforward as it might have been, which is ironic, I know. And what this means is that taxpayers that had a globally consistent transfer pricing documentation approach, think of uniform method selection and application, consistent tested party, uniform and consistent benchmarking approach and set of comparables, etc., may not be able to apply such an approach across jurisdictions for the same type of transactions. So they're going to have to navigate the different combination of counterparty jurisdictions that they have to deal with and how those jurisdictions select into this adoption, non-adoption, call it a matrix, right? So, and the taxpayer, as a result of this, may be required to take disparate approaches to testing and documenting the same intercompany transaction, depending on which side that analysis is representing. One performed and done under amount B, and the other, for example, under a full-blown conventional transfer pricing analysis. So again, like I said, ironically, a taxpayer's documentation approach under amount B may be more complicated, less streamlined than before. And you can also think that for taxpayers with several operating entities across jurisdictions that then select into these different choices, these inconsistencies and this fragmentation will only magnify.
Thanks, Kartikeya. So, Georgia, let's move on from this. Aside from the implementation options that Kartikeya discussed, what were some of the key changes or the evolutions in the February report as compared to the July consultation document? In our previous podcast, you had mentioned alternative A and alternative B with respect to the scoping criteria. Were there any notable changes there?
So, Christina, as Kartikeya has just anticipated the February 2024 document, shows that the inclusive framework seems to have agreed on alternative A for scoping criteria. And I believe that it was helpful to see the inclusive framework going for the more pragmatic approach. So under alternative A, entities would be in scope if they satisfy three parameters. All three parameters need to be satisfied at the same time. The first is that the transaction must be reliably priced with a one-side method, where the distributor, sales agent, or commissioner is the tested party. And this has not changed with respect to the transfer pricing analysis we do today. So you would still need to look at functions, assets, and risks. The second parameter is that the tested party must have a ratio of operating expenses to annual net sales within a certain range. So this is a purely quantitative parameter. And also, finally, the third parameter is that the tested party must not engage in non-distribution activities unless these non-distribution activities can be separately evaluated and priced. So this is what the scope of Amount B is now if a jurisdiction was to implement Amount B, and it's the scope that is included in the transfer pricing guidelines.
So if we still need to do a full functions, assets, risk analysis, plus these two additional steps that you've just laid out, where exactly is the simplification here?
Yeah, that's a good question, Christina. So I think the simplification of Amount B lies not only in the fact that taxpayers no longer need to conduct a comparable analysis, saved for what Kartikeya just told us, but also in the crucial point that in principle, there will be no longer uncertainty and disputes with the authorities on the return itself. And I think this is the true value of Amount B. However, it is important to note that all this depends really on whether authorities and taxpayers can agree on the scope and on, as Kartikeya said, really homogeneous implementation across the world. And maybe, Christina, we should also say that the February 2024 report introduced more detailed guidance on documentation and dispute resolution. For documentation, I don't really see much simplification, and this is on top of what Kartikeya just said. So the taxpayer must continue to justify the use of a one-sided method, and plus it now needs to justify the position within the pricing matrix using the quantitative ratios. And we think that this could be somewhat challenging sometimes, especially if you need to segment an entity or segment its assets, etc.
Thank you, Georgia. Now, Kartikeya, I'm going to flip back to you. Let's focus on the specifics of the pricing matrix that was in the February final report. Were there any significant updates or modifications as compared to the July consultation document? And how do these changes impact taxpayers?
Yeah, so the pricing matrix, as anyone who's been following Amount B is really at the core. What we see in the February report is very similar to what we saw in the consultation document in 2023. The matrix has the same basic construct with two dimensions, factor intensity being one, industry groupings being the other. And recall that factor intensity itself is a combination of two things, operating assets to sales ratio and operating expense to sales ratio. So there are 5 factor intensity levels or ranges and 3 industry groupings that then yield a total of 15 cells in the matrix. And where you map in that matrix then stipulates the arm's length return for an in-scope tested party. Okay, you'll be mapped into one of those 15 cells based on the combination of your industry and your factor intensity range. The return on sales is still the default net profit indicator, and the stipulated returns in that matrix range from 1.5% on the low end to 5.5% on the high end. Now, some of these returns are different from what we saw in the consultation document, but that difference is not significant. It's no more than a quarter of a percentage point. The industry groupings are generally consistent with what we had seen before. There are 3 industries, however, pharmaceuticals, health, and domestic vehicles that are now in group 2 instead of Group 3. Not sure what the reason for that is. Now, the consultation document had a Berry ratio guardrail, as it was called, and which has now been replaced by an operating expense cross-check, which really has the same purpose as the Berry ratio guardrail. And this is to either cap the returns or set a floor to the returns as determined from the pricing matrix when that when that return is viewed as translating into either too high a markup or a return on operating expenses for the tested party, or too low a return. And then what is considered too high or too low is specified in the caps and collars that are provided in the cross-check in a table. Now, one important development and change, and this is a positive one, and I view this as being responsive to the comments that were submitted as part of the consultation process, is that the final report no longer includes any modified pricing matrices which supersede the basic default, the basic or the default pricing matrix. This was so this was what was proposed in the consultation document, but has not been carried forward in the final February report. Having said that, there is still an adjustment based on sovereign credit rating for qualifying jurisdictions. Qualifying jurisdictions is, again, another list of countries that I think Georgia will cover as part of the supplementary guidance that was released in June. And so this additional adjustment can add a delta, an uplift to the basic return that you see in the core, the basic pricing matrix. So that's where we are with respect to the pricing matrix. Again, quick summary, very similar construct with some notable changes.
Thanks, Kartikeya. Now, shifting gears a bit, I also want to touch on the supplementary guidance that the OECD had released in June. Georgia, can you walk us through what was included in this guidance and what does it mean for different jurisdictions?
Sure, Christina. So the supplementary guidance released at the beginning of the summer is essentially a set of 3 lists of countries with a significant overlap among them. And I think this overlap is pretty important. So first up, there is the list of covered jurisdiction. Inclusive framework members are expected to respect the outcome under Amount B if the adopting jurisdiction is a covered jurisdiction, so if the jurisdiction is on this first list. And on this list, there are 66 jurisdictions, including G20 members like Argentina, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, as well as an OECD country like Costa Rica. And these 5 countries, so Argentina, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, and Costa Rica, are on this list because they have expressed interest in implementing Amount B. Then secondly, we have the list of qualifying jurisdictions. For these countries, a higher set of cap rates for the return on sales applies. Essentially, the cap on possible returns in these territories will be higher, potentially allowing for higher returns. And here we have 133 jurisdictions. So effectively, this higher cap would probably be the standard and the lower cap the exception. And these 133 jurisdictions include G20 countries as well, such as, for example, Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and again, OECD countries such as Costa Rica, Colombia. And then lastly, there is a list of jurisdictions that can apply an upward adjustment as a function of their sovereign credit rating. And this is, I think, quite important for taxpayers because returns in these jurisdictions will be higher than expected. And here we have 127 jurisdictions, including Brazil, Costa Rica, South Africa. And given that many of these jurisdictions on this third list are also on the first list of covered jurisdictions, inclusive framework members will need to respect this higher allocation. And we can imagine that this could lead to a significant reallocation of profits away from some developed economies to these jurisdictions on the third list.
So given these 3 different lists of jurisdictions that was part of the supplementary guidance in June, What is the inclusive framework trying to achieve here?
I think, Christina, that OECD and the inclusive framework here are trying to satisfy emerging and developing economies by allowing them some sort of higher returns. We know that these countries have often complained about not getting enough revenue under Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Some have even suggested that tax negotiations should move to the United Nations. So I think they're looking at these three lists. This is likely influenced the guidance more than a thorough economic analysis. And take Brazil, for example. If Brazil adopts Amount B, it will probably see higher returns than the basic matrix that Kartikeya described. This is because Brazil is on the three lists. So for Brazil, implementing Amount B could make sense, and here it's just me speculating. But there are other countries that appear on the three lists, for example, South Africa, for example, Costa Rica.
Thanks for that detailed breakdown, Georgia. So, with this latest June guidance, where do things stand now? What are the main concerns or reservations that are being expressed by both taxpayers and countries? Let's start with taxpayers and then we'll move on to the countries.
Yes, Christina, so there is quite a bit of uncertainty among taxpayers, essentially about which country will actually implement Amount B. And think that implementation could be very soon, in sort of 3 months, on the 1st of January 2025. And I think that the list of covered jurisdictions probably gives you some clues there, although being on the list is simply taking an option, it's not a real commitment. So this has led, this uncertainty around which country will implement has led to a lot of questions about whether taxpayers should start modeling Amount B. But honestly, we think that implementation is not the main issue. Whether or not Amount B is widely adopted, it's going to become a benchmark for both taxpayers and tax authorities. And this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, because of the simplicity of lifting a figure from the pricing table that Kartikeya described. And second, a number of countries have conducted econometric analysis, have engaged in extensive discussions on Amount B. Overall, so they have made significant investments, which I think gives them the confidence that they understand global distribution patterns well. So it's really important for taxpayers to understand how their specific situations measure up against Amount B. And then another big concern is whether Amount B will really simplify things. And we have heard about fragmented landscape from Kartikeya, but also if countries where tax disputes are more common and tougher don't adopt Amount B, it's difficult to see how the risk of disputes will be reduced. So, and there are also some more concerns of detail. It's about the need and how to segment your data, especially on the balance sheet side. It's about dealing with assets, possibly having to prepare additional documentation, as we have heard.
Thanks, Georgia. This definitely seems to be a theme as we're going through this in terms of whether or not this is actually going to be a simplified and streamlined pricing methodology. So that covers taxpayers' concerns. Let's switch gears. What are the concerns or reservations that have been expressed by countries?
No, because in reality, not many countries have been very public about their stance on Amount B. However, looking at the ones that have, I will start with India because India has become very influential in the international tax sphere. India seems interested in the concept of Amount B, but with some conditions. They want to make the scope of Amount B more qualitative. They are not very keen on its mandatory nature, and in the past, India has campaigned for higher returns within its borders. Also, we have Australia and New Zealand. They have made it clear that they will not implement Amount B. And I think what these three countries have in common is the fact that they generally require higher returns on distribution, and also they have the resources to achieve just that. And amount B maybe would be essentially a limitation for them. And I think that beyond these three countries that have been more public, there are certainly others that do not favor amount B very much. However, for the right deal, for the right design, they might be convinced to come on board. So in short, it looks like amount B won't be applied uniformly across various countries. However, keep in mind that, as we have mentioned before, amount B is expected to serve as a benchmark, probably setting a minimum for distribution returns, and we can expect that benchmark to be used in audits, APAs, MAP, etc.
Thanks, Georgia. So it seems like we have a lot of varied responses to this guidance. Kartik, what about the United States? What is the current stance of the US on Amount B, and how does it align or conflict with the positions of other major jurisdictions? Do you foresee any significant challenges or support in the near future?
Yeah, so let me add, by the way, that was a terrific summary by Georgia. So when it comes to the US, it's the US Treasury that has been leading the process. And from the get-go, I would say it has been a supporter of Amount B and its objectives. It's been deeply involved in the technical design of the framework and in trying to create consensus. Now, going back to the consultation document, which had these two alternatives for scoping, alternative A, more quantitative, alternative B, allowing for qualitative scoping criteria, the US was squarely in favor of alternative A. And in the present context, very much wants to see adoption of Amount B in mandatory form, not in the optional form as we currently see in the February report. And the reason is that the US views the optional version of Amount B as what they call a phase 1 version, and wanting to see a phase 2 mandatory version and get it over the finish line that applies across major jurisdictions. And for them, this is the mechanism. This is the means in that form to deliver the tax, certainty and simplification that was very much the promise that was laid out for this part of the project. And the US views the optional version as falling short of that objective. And I think a lot of us, based on everything we've discussed so far, would agree with that assessment. But there are, as Georgia said, there are many countries that appear to be on the opposite side of that viewpoint, or not sharing that viewpoint. And this is now getting into very conjectural territory on my part. It may be that the only way to reach a mandatory version is to allow countries the option of applying qualitative scoping criteria, or the alternative B that was there in the consultation document. What that then would do is that it would bring back the uncertainty around scoping that the current scoping criteria looks to avoid. So again, lots to see how things evolve, but the US view is pretty clear in where its preference lies, as represented and led by Treasury. Now, and the last thing I would say is that we have heard that Treasury is expected to release guidance, US guidance, on Amount B by year end. So that's the US view for you.
Thanks, Kartik. So before we sign off, Georgia and Kartik, given the fragmented approach to Amount B, what can or should in-scope companies be doing now to prepare for Amount B? What are some practical steps that they can take to navigate this evolving landscape? Georgia, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Christina. I think I would start from evaluating the scoping criteria in the jurisdictions where entities are potentially in scope. I would start with reviewing the functional analysis and the transfer pricing policies that are associated with these type of entities, and then clearly monitoring individual jurisdictions, whether they are adopting or not, and if they are adopting, are they adopting Amount B as mandatory or as a safe harbor, or do they remain silent on that?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think modeling the consequences of Amount B is going to be very important for taxpayers, and this is under different permutations of Amount B adoption. So, countries opting in, opting out, opting in, with amount B in mandatory form or safe harbor form. I think all of that is going to be important for taxpayers to consider and model out and then assess the impact on their tax position and operating models. It'll also help them in revisiting their compliance and documentation approach to ensure that the approach that they will have under this new environment continues to be coherent and efficient. And then finally, something we haven't really touched upon in this discussion, but we actually do cover it in the article that you mentioned that is forthcoming and that you mentioned earlier on, Christina, is that some taxpayers will need to put and give attention to figuring out and analyzing the knock-on effects that Amount B may have on their overall value chain and operating model. And what I mean by that is there's only so much profit in the system. If Amount B is going to raise the required return that they have to attribute to baseline distributors and marketing functions, there may be less left to the point where it may create strain elsewhere for other functions and activities in the system.
Thank you, Georgia and Kartikeya, for those practical insights. It's always a pleasure to have you both here to help us navigate these complex topics. And to our listeners, we appreciate you tuning in and spending time with us. We hope you found today's discussion on Amount B both informative and engaging. We'll be back next month with another episode of TP Talks, where we'll continue to explore key transfer pricing issues and developments from around the world. Until then, have a great day.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.